May 21, 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The spring air carried the scent of lilacs and rubble dust as former Captain Werner Hoffmann stood at the edge of a small park, watching American soldiers distributing chocolate to children. His uniform had been exchanged for civilian clothes, his officer's insignia buried in the garden behind his sister's damaged house. Among the American soldiers was a tall African-American man named Sergeant James Wilson, whose kind smile seemed at odds with everything Werner had been taught about Americans, especially those with dark skin. Little did Werner know that within months, his entire worldview would be challenged by what he and other former German officers would do when faced with something they had been conditioned to despise: relationships between German women and black American soldiers. The response of these former officers would prove so unexpected, so counter to propaganda narratives, that many would later refuse to believe it happened at all. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how human connection can triumph over years of indoctrination, and how the chaos of post-war Germany created unexpected allies in the face of lingering prejudice from all sides. The war had been over for just 2 weeks. Germany lay in ruins physically and psychologically. Werner Hoffmann, 34 years old, former captain in the German army and decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, was among the millions of German soldiers who had surrendered and been processed by Allied authorities. Unlike many of his comrades who remained in prisoner of war camps, Werner had been quickly released due to his lack of political affiliations and his background as a mathematics teacher before the war. The Americans think teachers can rebuild Germany, his friend Karl Müller had told him during their processing. They are releasing us first. Be grateful you chose education instead of a military career. Werner wasn't feeling particularly grateful as he watched the American soldiers in the park. His country was occupied, his city in ruins, and his future uncertain. He had lost his apartment in the bombing of February 1945 and now lived with his widowed sister Magda and her 2 young daughters in a house with a partially collapsed roof. Every day was a struggle for food, for fuel, for purpose. "Herr Hoffmann," a voice called out. Werner turned to see Frau Becker, the elderly woman who lived across the street. She clutched a small basket covered with a cloth. "Good afternoon, Frau Becker," Werner replied, automatically straightening his posture, as he had been trained to do in the presence of civilians. "I managed to get some eggs," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Would you fix my radio in exchange for 2? Magda told me you were good with electronics." Werner nodded. Before the war, he had indeed tinkered with radios as a hobby. "Of course. I will come by this evening." As Frau Becker shuffled away, Werner's attention was drawn back to the American soldiers, particularly to Sergeant Wilson. The black soldier was showing a young boy how to blow a bubble with chewing gum, both of them laughing when the bubble popped on the child's face. Werner found himself walking closer, drawn by curiosity. The Americans had been in Nuremberg for weeks now, but Werner had avoided them as much as possible. Pride, perhaps, or shame. But food was scarce, and the Americans had food. "Oh, you want some chocolate, mister?" Sergeant Wilson addressed Werner in heavily accented German. Werner stiffened. "No, thank you," he replied in English. His years teaching mathematics had included learning basic English, which he had improved during the war by interrogating British prisoners. Wilson raised his eyebrows. "Well, look at that. You speak English better than I speak German." He extended his hand. "James Wilson from Chicago." Werner hesitated before shaking the offered hand. "Werner Hoffmann, Nuremberg." "Nice to meet you, Werner. You live around here?" "Yes, with my sister and her daughters." Wilson nodded, his expression softening. "Tough times. How old are the girls?" 8 and 10. "Well, here," Wilson said, holding out several chocolate bars. "For them." Werner stared at the chocolate, his pride warring with practicality. The girls had not tasted chocolate in over a year. "Thank you," he finally said, accepting the gift. "No problem. Kids are kids, right? Doesn't matter where they're from." The simplicity of the statement struck Werner. During his 4 years in the army, he had been surrounded by rhetoric that emphasized differences, hierarchies, the intrinsic separation of peoples. Yet here was this American soldier, a man who, according to everything Werner had been taught, should be his inferior, speaking a truth that seemed suddenly, blindingly obvious. Children were children. Walking home with the chocolate bars in his pocket, Werner found himself thinking about the encounter. The American had been kind. Not at all what years of propaganda had led Werner to expect. It was disorienting. At home, Werner's nieces, Lotte and Emma, were delighted with the chocolate. Magda looked at him questioningly but said nothing. Later, as they ate a thin soup made from potatoes and a handful of dried vegetables, Werner mentioned his encounter. He seemed decent. The American. Magda's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Be careful, Werner. The rules are different now, but some attitudes haven't changed. Not everyone approves of fraternization. Werner frowned. I merely spoke to him and accepted chocolate for the girls. Even that is more than some would do, Magda replied, especially with a colored soldier. Werner had no response to that. It was true. Despite the defeat of the regime, many of its poisonous ideas lingered in people's minds, including, he had to admit, his own. The following day, Werner went to the city center to register for work. The American occupation authorities had established an employment office to match German civilians with reconstruction projects. The line stretched around the block, hundreds of men and women hoping for work that would earn them ration cards and a small wage. As Werner waited, he noticed several of his former comrades in the line. There was Friedrich Müller, who had served as a lieutenant under Werner's command, Otto Schultz, a fellow captain, and Hans Bauer, a major who had once given Werner a dressing down for showing leniency to a Russian prisoner. None of them wore any indication of their former ranks, all reduced to civilian status by defeat. Hans spotted Werner and made his way over. Hoffmann, he said quietly, I heard you were back in Nuremberg. Hans, Werner acknowledged with a nod, are you living nearby? Southside with cousins, their house was mostly spared. Hans looked around before continuing in an even lower voice. Several of us meet sometimes, former officers, just to talk, share information. You should join us. Werner hesitated. He had no desire to rehash the war or listen to bitter recriminations about betrayal and defeat, topics that dominated most conversations among former military men. I'm focused on rebuilding now, he said carefully. The past is past. Hans studied him. The past is never just past, Werner, and the future concerns us all, especially with these Americans changing everything. He gestured subtly toward a group of American military police standing near the employment office entrance. Tonight, 8 o'clock. The back room of the Blue Dove Inn on Hauptstrasse. What's left of it, anyway? Before Werner could decline again, Hans melted back into the crowd. When Werner's turn finally came, he was assigned to a rubble clearance crew, work that would begin the following day. It was physical labor, far from his former profession as a teacher, but it would provide ration cards for himself and contribute to Magda's household. That evening, despite his reservations, Werner found himself walking toward the Blue Dove Inn. Curiosity, he told himself. Nothing more. He wanted to know what his former comrades were discussing. Knowledge was never harmful. The Blue Dove had survived the bombing relatively intact, though its windows were boarded up and its sign hung askew. Werner entered through the side door as Hans had instructed and found himself in a small, dimly lit room. About 15 men were gathered there, most of them familiar faces, former officers of various ranks, now all dressed as civilians. Werner! Friedrich greeted him warmly, pulling out a chair. Good to see you. We weren't sure you would come. Werner sat down, accepting a small glass of schnapps someone pushed toward him. Just curious about what brings you all together. Hans stood up, commanding the room's attention as naturally as he had once commanded troops. Gentlemen, for those who haven't attended before, these meetings are about information exchange and mutual support. We discuss developments in the occupation, opportunities for employment appropriate to our skills, and changing social dynamics. Several men nodded grimly at this last point. We are German officers, Hans continued. Regardless of what papers the Americans have issued us, we have responsibilities to our community, to each other, and to Germany's future. Werner sipped his schnapps, skeptical but listening. Over the next hour, various men reported on conditions in different parts of the city. Who was hiring? Which American officers could be reasoned with? Which areas were receiving more food aid? Practical information mostly, though tinged with resentment toward the occupation authorities. Then the topic shifted. "We need to address the fraternization issue," Otto said, his voice tight. "It's getting worse." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "My neighbor's daughter is openly walking with an American soldier," said an older man Werner didn't recognize. 19 years old, flaunting herself on his arm for a few chocolate bars and cigarettes. Her father fought in Russia and is still in a camp somewhere. It's disgraceful. "The women are hungry," another man said reasonably. "Can we blame them for doing what they must to eat?" "There's hunger and then there's betrayal," Otto snapped, "especially with the colored troops. Have you seen them in the dance halls with our German girls?" The mood in the room darkened. Werner felt a familiar discomfort, the old toxic ideas threatening to resurface despite his encounter with Sergeant Wilson. Hans cleared his throat. "This is indeed a concern. The American authorities officially discourage fraternization, but they do little to enforce their own rules. We must consider how to protect our women." "And what do you propose?" Werner found himself asking, his voice sharper than intended. "We lost the war, Hans. We are not in a position to enforce anything." Hans looked at Werner coldly. "So we should just allow our women to be degraded, to betray their race, their country." "Their country betrayed them first," Werner said quietly. 6 years of war, millions dead, our cities in ruins. All for what? Perhaps we should focus on rebuilding rather than controlling who people speak to or care for." The room fell silent. Werner realized he had gone too far, challenged too directly the worldview that many of these men still clung to despite defeat. Hans's jaw tightened. "You always were soft, Hoffman. Too academic, too willing to question." "Questioning is what teachers do," Werner replied, standing up. "Thank you for the schnapps, gentlemen. I don't think these meetings are for me." As Werner turned to leave, Friedrich caught his arm. "Wait, Werner, don't go. Hans, let's not argue among ourselves. We need unity now more than ever." Hans considered, then nodded curtly. "Stay, Hoffman. We have different views, but as Friedrich says, we need all the allies we can get." Werner hesitated, then sat back down. For the remainder of the meeting, he said little, but he observed much. Despite the resentment and outdated ideology evident in some comments, he also noted genuine concern for the community's welfare. These men were lost, clinging to their former identities because they had nothing else. As the meeting broke up, Friedrich walked with Werner toward the residential area where both lived. "Hans means well," Friedrich said. "He's just struggling to adjust. We all are." "Adjustment doesn't mean holding on to hateful ideas," Werner replied. Friedrich sighed. "No. But change takes time. And speaking of change," he lowered his voice, "I should tell you that my sister Elsa has been seeing an American soldier, a colored one." Werner looked at his friend in surprise. "And how do you feel about that?" Friedrich ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Conflicted. Elsa is 26, a grown woman. Her fiancé died at Stalingrad. The American, Robert, treats her well, brings food, is respectful." He laughed humorlessly. "Everything we were told about them was lies, it seems." Werner thought of Sergeant Wilson's kindness with the children. "Yes, it does seem that way. But others won't see it as I do," Friedrich continued. "Elsa has already been called names in the street. Someone painted a slur on our door last week." He stopped walking and faced Werner directly. "That's actually why I wanted you at the meeting tonight. I'm worried, not just for Elsa but for others in her situation. Things could turn ugly." Werner understood then. Friedrich hadn't been trying to recruit him to some revanchist cause. He had been looking for allies who might take a more moderate position. How many are there? Women seeing black American soldiers? "More than you'd think," Friedrich replied. "The colored troops are stationed in separate areas, but they come into the city on leave, and many of our women find them different from what they expected. Generous, respectful. Some genuinely care for each other." Werner nodded slowly. "What can I do?" "Just be aware. Talk to others like yourself, reasonable men. Former officers still command respect in the community. If voices like yours and mine speak for tolerance, it might prevent incidents. The conversation left Werner troubled. The next day, as he worked clearing rubble from a bombed-out apartment building, he found himself watching the interactions between American soldiers supervising the work and the German civilians. The relationships were complex, a mixture of resentment, practical cooperation, and occasional genuine friendship. During a break, Werner spotted Sergeant Wilson across the street, talking with a group of German women outside a newly established aid distribution center. One of the women, a tall blonde in a carefully mended dress, laughed at something Wilson said, touching his arm in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. Without fully understanding why, Werner drifted closer, close enough to hear their conversation, which was taking place in a mixture of broken German and English. "My mother still cannot believe you have never had proper Sauerbraten," the blonde woman was saying. "She insists you must come for Sunday dinner." Wilson smiled. "I'd be honored, Greta. But you sure your family won't mind? Some folks, well, they might not approve." Greta's expression hardened slightly. "My father is gone. My brother is still in a prisoner camp in England. It is only my mother and me now, and she says any man who brings us coffee and treats her arthritis with real medicine is welcome at our table, no matter what color his skin is." Wilson chuckled. "Well, when you put it that way." They were interrupted by shouts from across the street. 3 young German men, barely out of their teens, were approaching, their expressions hostile. "Whore!" one of them called out in German. "Lying down with animals!" Werner felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. Before he could think, he was striding toward the young men, intercepting them before they could reach Wilson and Greta. "That's enough," he said firmly, drawing himself up to his full height and adopting the commanding tone he had used as an officer. The young men faltered momentarily, sensing authority. "This is none of your business, old man," the apparent leader said, though with less conviction. "I'm making it my business," Werner replied. He switched to a quieter voice, one that had always been more effective at commanding respect than shouting. "I fought for 4 years on the Eastern Front. I've seen what hatred does. Germany has had enough of it. Go home." The young men looked uncertain, glancing at each other. "You defend her? And him?" one asked incredulously. "I defend decency," Werner said simply, "something we've had too little of for too long." There was a tense moment when Werner thought they might attack him, but then the leader spat on the ground and gestured to his friends. "Come on. He's probably another one who surrendered too easily." When they had gone, Werner turned to find Wilson and Greta watching him, with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "Thank you," Greta said. "Those boys, they think they're defending Germany's honor, but they're just continuing the same old hatred." Werner nodded awkwardly, suddenly uncomfortable with his impulsive action. Wilson extended his hand. "We meet again, Mr. Hoffman. That was a brave thing you did." Werner shook the offered hand, noticing as he did so the curious glances from passers-by. Not brave, just right. Later that evening, as Werner repaired Frau Becker's radio as promised, the old woman chatted about neighborhood gossip. "Did you hear about Greta Fischer? Living on Müllerstrasse with her mother. She's been walking out with a black American soldier. Can you imagine? After everything we were taught." Werner concentrated on the radio's wiring. "Perhaps what we were taught was wrong." Frau Becker looked shocked. "Werner Hoffman, you were an officer. Surely you can't approve of such mixing." Werner reconnected the final wire and closed the radio's case. "The war is over, Frau Becker. Many things we believed have proven false." He tested the radio, which crackled to life, playing a jazz tune from an American military station. There, good as new. The following Sunday, Werner was surprised to receive an invitation from Friedrich to join his family for dinner. "Elsa's American friend will be there," Friedrich explained when he delivered the invitation in person. She thought having another open-minded German present might make things easier. "And after what you did for Greta Fischer, word of which has spread, by the way, I thought you might accept." Werner agreed, more curious than anything else. That evening, he arrived at Friedrich's apartment with a small bunch of wildflowers for Elsa and a rare treat, a chocolate bar he had saved from Sergeant Wilson's gift for Friedrich's mother. The dinner was initially awkward. Robert Johnson, a corporal in a quartermaster unit, was clearly nervous, sitting stiffly and speaking carefully. Elsa was anxious, watching her mother for reactions. Friedrich's mother, a stern woman in her 60s, was polite but reserved. Friedrich himself tried too hard to keep conversation flowing. Only Werner felt strangely at ease. There was something almost amusing about the situation. A former German officer breaking bread with a black American soldier, both of them trying to navigate a social situation that neither of their societies had prepared them for. As the meal progressed and a bottle of hoarded pre-war wine was opened, the atmosphere relaxed. Robert spoke of his home in Pennsylvania, of working in his father's carpentry shop before the war, of his 3 younger sisters. He was articulate, thoughtful, and clearly devoted to Elsa, watching her with an expression that couldn't be misinterpreted. Friedrich's mother, observing this, gradually softened. When Robert offered to help clear the dishes, an action that clearly surprised her, she actually smiled. Later, as Robert and Elsa stepped onto the small balcony for some privacy, Friedrich's mother turned to Werner. "He is not what I expected," she admitted quietly. "No," Werner agreed. "None of this is what we expected." "What will happen to them?" she asked. "A German woman and a Negro American. The world is not kind to such couples." Werner had been wondering the same thing. "I don't know, but perhaps the world is changing. It must change after all that's happened." As Werner walked home that night, he found himself thinking about the evening, about Robert and Elsa, about Sergeant Wilson and Greta Fischer, about change and resistance to change, about how quickly hatred could be taught, and how much harder it was to unlearn. He thought too about the meeting of former officers, about Hans's anger and Friedrich's concern, about the young men who had harassed Greta in the street. Seeds of trouble were being sown, and Werner wondered what would grow from them. The next day, as he worked clearing rubble, Werner spotted Hans and Otto watching him from across the street. Their expressions were unreadable from a distance, but their posture communicated disapproval. Werner nodded to them, but they turned and walked away without acknowledging him. That evening there was a knock at Magda's door. When Werner opened it, he found Friedrich standing there, his face pale. "What's wrong?" Werner asked, immediately concerned. "There's going to be trouble," Friedrich said, his voice low. "Hans and some of the others are organizing something against the women who are seeing colored soldiers. I heard them planning at the Blue Dove." Werner's stomach tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "They're calling it a public shaming. They plan to identify women who are involved with black Americans and make examples of them. Haircutting, marking them somehow, like in the old days, when women who fraternized with the enemy were punished." "When?" Werner asked, already reaching for his coat. "Tomorrow night. They've identified several women, including Elsa and Greta Fischer. I think they're planning to start with Greta because she lives more isolated, just with her elderly mother." Werner thought quickly. "We need to warn them. And we need to find others who will stand with us against this madness." "I've already spoken to a few," Friedrich said. "Some of the other officers from our old unit. Not all share Hans's views. 5 or 6 have agreed to help." "That may not be enough," Werner said grimly. Friedrich hesitated, then said, "I've also told Robert. He and some of his friends, other colored soldiers, want to protect the women. But that could make things worse if there's a confrontation. American soldiers fighting German civilians would be a disaster." Werner nodded. The situation was like a powder keg. One wrong move, and the fragile peace of the occupation could erupt into violence that would harm everyone. "We need to think strategically," Werner said, his mind shifting naturally into the analytical patterns of military planning. "What are our resources? What are our objectives?" As they talked into the night, a plan began to take shape. Werner realized that this might be the most important operation he had ever commanded, not to destroy this time, but to protect, to build something rather than tear it down, to defend not territory or ideology, but simple human connection in a world that had seen too little of it. The war might be over, but for Werner Hoffmann and his unlikely allies, a new battle was just beginning. A battle against the lingering ghosts of hatred that threatened to haunt Germany's future. And the outcome would surprise everyone involved, creating a story so unexpected that in later years, many would refuse to believe it had happened at all. Dawn broke over Nuremberg on May 28, 1945, bathing the broken city in soft golden light. Werner Hoffmann stood at the window of his sister's kitchen, watching the street come to life as people emerged for another day of survival in post-war Germany. The events that would unfold over the next 48 hours would challenge everything he thought he knew about his former comrades, about courage, about what it truly meant to be honorable in dishonorable times. Werner had slept little. After Friedrich's warning about Hans's planned public shaming of women involved with black American soldiers, they had worked through most of the night, reaching out to trusted former officers who might stand with them against such barbarity. By morning, they had assembled a small group of allies, 8 former officers who agreed that such actions would only bring more suffering to a community already drowning in it. "You look terrible," Magda said, placing a cup of ersatz coffee in front of her brother. Real coffee was a luxury reserved for special occasions or American gifts. "Didn't sleep much," Werner admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "This business with the women and the American soldiers?" Magda asked, her voice carefully neutral. Werner had told her about the situation the previous evening. Werner nodded. Hans and his group planned to act tonight, starting with Greta Fischer. Magda's lips thinned. "I know Greta. A good girl. Her father was a doctor, taken by the Russians at Stalingrad. Never came back. You don't disapprove of her relationship with the American?" Magda sighed, sitting down across from her brother. "Werner, I lost my husband at Kursk. My daughters lost their father. What good did all our hatred do us? All our belief in superiority, it brought us nothing but ruins and graves." She looked out at the damaged street. "If Greta found someone kind, someone who treats her well, who am I to judge the color of his skin?" Werner reached across the table and squeezed his sister's hand. Her words crystallized something he had been feeling but hadn't fully articulated, even to himself. The ideology that had consumed Germany for years had been not just morally wrong but practically disastrous. It had led to nothing but destruction. Perhaps it was time to build something new on different foundations. At 8 o'clock, Werner met with Friedrich and the other sympathetic former officers in the back room of a partially repaired cafe. The group included men from various units and backgrounds. Klaus Weber, a former intelligence officer, Martin Brandt, who had served on the general staff before being wounded at Normandy, Joseph Keller, a logistics expert, and 5 others. All had independently come to question the racial doctrines they had once been expected to uphold. "Hans has about 15 men committed to his action," Friedrich reported. "They plan to gather at the Blue Dove at 8 this evening, then proceed to Greta Fischer's home on Müllerstrasse." "What exactly do they intend?" asked Martin, his face grave. "Public humiliation," Friedrich replied, cutting her hair, possibly marking her face with paint, forcing her to stand in a public square with a sign declaring her crime of race betrayal. His voice was tight with disgust. "Methods from a time we should have left behind." "And after Greta?" Joseph inquired. "They have a list, at least 6 women they know to be involved with black American soldiers, including my sister Elsa." The men exchanged troubled glances. This was no small matter they were involving themselves in. To stand against Hans and his group meant potentially being labeled traitors to their own kind, in a community where such labels could be dangerous. "What is our plan?" Klaus asked, addressing Werner, whom they had tacitly acknowledged as their leader, perhaps out of habit from his reputation as a thoughtful and ethical officer during the war. Werner unfolded a rough map of the neighborhood. Direct confrontation could escalate to violence, which would bring in the American authorities. Nobody wants that. He traced a route on the map. "Instead, we position ourselves here, at the intersection of Hauptstrasse and Müllerstrasse, an hour before Hans's group is scheduled to move. We intercept them before they reach Greta's home." "And then?" Martin pressed. "We reason with them," Werner said simply. Several men looked skeptical. "Hans isn't known for his reasonableness," Joseph pointed out. Werner nodded. "True, but he is known for his respect for the chain of command. Several of you outranked him during the war, and all of us together present a unified front that might give him pause. And if reasoning fails? Klaus asked the question they were all thinking. Werner's expression hardened slightly. Then we form a physical barrier if necessary, but no violence unless in defense. We are not thugs. We were officers of the German army. We stood for order, not chaos. There were nods around the table. Despite everything that had happened, despite the fall of the regime and the discrediting of so much they had fought for, that core identity remained. They were men who had led others, who had been responsible for order and discipline in the midst of war's chaos. There's another factor to consider, Friedrich added. As I mentioned to Werner, Robert and several other black American soldiers want to protect the women. I've persuaded them to stay away to let us handle this German problem among Germans, but they'll be nearby, watching. If things go badly, they'll intervene. This added a layer of complexity that sobered everyone. A clash between German civilians and American soldiers could have severe consequences for the entire city. All the more reason to resolve this peacefully, Werner concluded. We meet at 7 this evening at the corner of Breite Gasse and Hauptstrasse. From there, we proceed to the interception point. As the meeting broke up, Martin pulled Werner aside. This is a risky path you're taking, Hoffmann. Hans has friends in the emerging local government, men who might still have influence as things reorganize. Werner met the older man's gaze steadily. And what path would you suggest? Standing aside while women are humiliated for the crime of finding comfort amid devastation? Haven't we all had enough of persecution? Martin studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Yes, we have. I'm with you, Hoffmann. I just wanted to be sure you understand the potential consequences. I understand them better than most, Werner replied quietly. I saw what happened when good men stood aside and let hatred flourish. I won't make that mistake again. After the meeting, Werner made his way to Müllerstrasse to warn Greta Fischer personally. He found her hanging laundry in the small courtyard behind her building. Her movements brisk and efficient, despite the evident fatigue in her face. Like most Germans, she was thinner than would have been normal before the war, her cheekbones prominent in a face that still retained traces of youthful beauty. Herr Hoffmann, she greeted him, recognizing him from his intervention days earlier. What brings you here? Werner explained the situation as gently as possible, watching her face pale as she understood the threat. They would do this. In 1945, after everything that's happened? Her voice trembled slightly, but Werner noted the anger beneath the fear. Some people cling to old hatreds when everything else has been taken from them, Werner said. I came to warn you so you and your mother might stay elsewhere tonight. With friends, perhaps? Greta straightened, the wet sheet she was hanging forgotten in her hands. No, I will not hide. I have done nothing wrong. Greta, my father was a respected physician. My brother died fighting for Germany at Monte Cassino. I have worked as a nurse through 6 years of war. I have pulled children from rubble during air raids. Her voice grew stronger with each sentence. And now, because I care for a kind and decent man whose only crime is the color of his skin, I should hide like a criminal. Werner found himself oddly moved by her defiance. We will try to prevent this from happening. But if we fail, the consequences could be unpleasant. Life has been unpleasant for a very long time, Herr Hoffmann. Greta resumed, hanging the sheet with sharp, angry movements. But I thank you for the warning, and for what you are trying to do. There are not many who would stand up for women like me. As Werner turned to leave, Greta called after him. Herr Hoffmann, James, Sergeant Wilson, speaks very highly of you. He says you are a man of honor. I believe he is right. The simple statement stayed with Werner as he made his way back to his sister's home. Honor. What did that word even mean anymore? In the army, honor had been tied to duty, to following orders, to fighting for one's country. But what was honor now, in defeat, in occupation, in a world turned upside down? Perhaps honor was simply doing what was right, even when, especially when, it was difficult. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Werner spent part of it continuing his assigned rubble clearance work, not wanting to draw attention by breaking his routine. The physical labor helped channel his nervous energy. At 6 o'clock, he returned home to wash and change into his cleanest civilian clothes. If he was going to face down Hans and his group, he wanted to look respectable, authoritative. "Be careful," Magda said as he prepared to leave. "Men like Hans are dangerous. They have nothing left to lose." "We all have nothing left to lose," Werner replied, "except perhaps our humanity, and that's worth defending." As planned, Werner met Friedrich and the others at 7 o'clock. All had made similar efforts to appear at their best, some even wearing ties despite the warm evening. Without discussing it, they had collectively understood the importance of presenting themselves as men of dignity, not street brawlers. They proceeded to the intersection where they planned to intercept Hans's group, positioning themselves casually, as though they had simply gathered to talk. Werner noticed several American military police on routine patrol nearby and hoped their presence would remain routine. At precisely 8:15, Hans's group appeared, walking with purpose down Hauptstrasse. Werner counted 14 men, most of them former military, some still wearing parts of their uniforms despite regulations against it. Hans himself led the group, his face set in grim determination. He faltered visibly when he saw Werner and the others standing in their path. "What is this?" Hans demanded, coming to a halt a few meters away. "A conversation," Werner replied calmly, stepping forward. "Between former comrades." Hans's eyes narrowed as he took in the assembled group. "Move aside, Hoffmann. This doesn't concern you." "I think it does," Werner said. "We all fought for Germany, we all suffered defeat. But what you're planning tonight isn't about Germany's future. It's about clinging to the worst parts of our past." A murmur ran through Hans's group. Werner could see uncertainty on some faces, determination on others. "These women have betrayed their race," Hans said, his voice rising. "They lie down with animals while good German men rot in prison camps. They need to be taught a lesson." "And who appointed you the teacher?" This came from Martin Brandt, who stepped forward to stand beside Werner. "I outranked you during the war, Bauer. I recall you were quite insistent on respecting the chain of command then." Hans flushed. "That was during the war. The army is dissolved now." "But honor remains," Josef Keller added, joining Werner and Martin, "and there is no honor in terrorizing women whose only crime is finding comfort in a world we helped destroy." One by one, the other former officers moved to form a line with Werner, creating a human barrier across the street. Werner could see the impact this unified front was having on Hans's followers, many of whom were younger, junior officers or non-commissioned officers who had been conditioned to respect rank. "You're defending race traitors?" Hans asked incredulously. "Men who fought for Germany?" "We're defending human dignity," Werner replied. "Something we lost sight of for too long." Friedrich stepped forward. "Hans, my sister Elsa is on your list. The woman who nursed our mother through pneumonia last winter, who worked 16-hour shifts in the emergency hospital during the final bombing, who mourned her fiancé for 2 years after Stalingrad. Is she suddenly worth less because she found love with an American?" Hans seemed momentarily at a loss. Friedrich had been a respected officer, known for his steadfast reliability. Taking advantage of the hesitation, Werner pressed further. "What do you hope to achieve tonight? These women will still exist. Their relationships will still exist. The only thing that will change is that you will have added more suffering to a city already drowning in it." "It's a matter of principle," Hans insisted, though with less conviction. "German women belong with German men. And where were these principles when our leaders were sending millions to their deaths?" This came from Klaus Weber, his voice sharp with controlled anger. Where was this concern for racial purity when it came to making alliances with the Japanese? Principles seem remarkably flexible when power is involved. Werner could see Hans's resolve wavering, but also the dangerous flush of humiliation spreading across his face. A humiliated man was unpredictable. Werner changed tactics. "Hans," he said more gently, "we all feel it. The defeat, the shame, the sense that everything we believed in has crumbled, but taking it out on women who are just trying to survive, trying to find some happiness in this. A wasteland we've created. That won't restore our pride." A tense silence fell. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife's edge. Werner was acutely aware of the American MPs still visible at the far end of the street, watching with increasing interest. If this confrontation escalated, they would certainly intervene. Then, unexpectedly, one of Hans's own group stepped forward and moved to stand with Werner's line. It was Otto Schultz, who had been at the original meeting at the Blue Dove. "He's right, Hans," Otto said quietly. "This isn't the way. We need to rebuild, not tear down further." Hans stared at Otto with naked betrayal. "You too?" Otto shrugged, looking suddenly very tired. "I have a daughter, Hans, 17 years old. What kind of future do I want for her? One where mobs can decide her fate based on who she loves. Haven't we seen enough of that?" The defection had a visible effect on Hans's group. Several men looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. Hans, sensing his control slipping, made a last desperate attempt. "They're contaminating German bloodlines. After everything we fought for—" "We lost, Hans," Werner interrupted, his voice flat and final. "We lost because we were wrong. Not just strategically wrong, morally wrong. And continuing down that same path won't lead anywhere different." For a moment Werner thought Hans might charge him, might try to force his way through by sheer will. But then Hans's shoulders sagged, just slightly. A gesture of defeat that Werner recognized from having seen it countless times during the war's final months. "You're making a mistake," Hans said, but the force had gone out of his voice. "This isn't over." "No," Werner agreed. "It isn't. Germany's future isn't over, but it needs to be different from its past." Hans turned away, gesturing sharply to his remaining loyal followers. Most followed him as he headed back the way they had come, but 3 remained behind, looking uncertain. One of them, a young former lieutenant named Dieter, approached Werner hesitantly. "Captain Hoffmann, what you said about rebuilding, do you really believe we can? After everything?" Werner looked at the young man, probably no more than 25, his face still bearing the hollow-eyed look of someone who had seen combat too young. "I have to believe it, Dieter. Otherwise, what was the point of surviving?" As Hans's group retreated into the gathering dusk, Werner felt a complex mixture of relief and lingering tension. They had averted violence tonight, but Hans's parting words suggested the matter wasn't truly resolved. "We should check on the women," Friedrich suggested. "Make sure they're safe." Werner nodded. "I'll go to Greta Fischer's. The rest of you, divide up and check on the others." As the group dispersed, Werner made his way to Müllerstrasse. He found Greta sitting on the steps outside her building, wrapped in a shawl despite the mild evening. She wasn't alone. Sergeant Wilson sat beside her, not touching her, but close enough to make their relationship clear. "Herr Hoffmann," Greta called when she spotted him. "James told me what you and the others did, confronting those men." She rose to her feet. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Werner said, suddenly embarrassed. "It was the right thing to do." Wilson stood as well, extending his hand. Still, not many would have done it, standing up against their own. Werner shook the offered hand. "Perhaps that's been the problem all along. Not enough people willing to stand against their own when their own are wrong." The 3 of them talked for a while in the deepening twilight. Werner learned more about Wilson's life in Chicago, where he had worked as a mechanic before the war, about his hopes to use the GI Bill to study engineering when he returned home, about his widowed mother and 2 younger brothers. In turn, Werner found himself sharing stories from his teaching days, his dreams of returning to education once schools reopened. It was the most normal conversation he had experienced in years, unmarred by ideology or the hierarchies of war. As he prepared to leave, Wilson hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask you something, Hoffmann? Why did you do it? Stand up for us? Most white folks back home wouldn't, let alone Germans after everything you folks were taught." Werner considered the question seriously. "During the war, I was in Russia for a time. I saw things that made me question what we were doing, what we were becoming." He paused, finding it difficult to put into words. "I think we lost something essential in those years. Our humanity, perhaps. Tonight felt like reclaiming a small piece of it." Wilson nodded slowly. "I get that. War changes a man, makes him see things different." "Yes," Werner agreed. "It does." Over the following days, Werner and his group maintained their vigilance, concerned that Hans might make another attempt, but it seemed the confrontation had truly diffused the immediate threat. Hans and his closest allies retreated to their own circle, avoiding Werner and the others when they encountered them in the city. What Werner hadn't anticipated was the wider impact of their stand. Word spread quickly through the community, as such stories always do in close quarters. Former German officers defending relationships between German women and Black American soldiers. It was unexpected enough to capture attention, to spark conversation. Not all reactions were positive, of course. Werner received cold looks from some neighbors. Magda reported that one of the other mothers had stopped speaking to her at the children's makeshift school. But there were positive responses too. Frau Becker, to Werner's surprise, baked bread with precious hoarded flour and brought it to Magda's house as a gesture of support. "My late husband always said that character shows itself in how we treat those different from ourselves," the elderly woman told Werner. "I think he would have approved of what you did." More significantly, other couples who had been hiding their relationships began to appear in public, not flaunting themselves, but no longer skulking in shadows. A German woman and a Black American soldier walking together in a park, sitting at the same table in a cafe. Simple, human interactions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. 1 week after the confrontation with Hans, Friedrich invited Werner to Sunday dinner again. This time the atmosphere was noticeably more relaxed. Robert brought a friend, another black soldier named David, who was seeing a German woman from the western part of the city. Friedrich's mother fussed over both men, insisting they eat seconds of the modest but carefully prepared meal. After dinner, as they sat drinking ersatz coffee, Robert cleared his throat. "I have some news," he said, looking at Elsa with evident affection. "My unit is being transferred to Bremen next month." A shadow crossed Elsa's face. "So soon?" Robert reached for her hand. "I've requested permission to marry before I go, if you'll have me." The table fell silent. Marriage was a much more significant step than dating. It meant Elsa would eventually leave Germany, leave her family. Friedrich's mother was the first to respond. "Well," she said pragmatically, "we will need to see about finding enough food for a proper wedding meal." Elsa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her mother in surprise. "You approve?" The older woman sniffed. "I approve of a man who loves my daughter. The rest is details." She turned to Robert. "Though I hope you will visit Germany sometimes, so I can see my grandchildren." Robert smiled broadly. "Yes, ma'am, as often as we can." Werner watched the scene with a sense of witnessing something historic, though on a small personal scale. Here, in this modest apartment, something new was being born from the ashes of war, a connection that transcended the artificial boundaries that had been drawn between people. Later, as Werner walked home through the darkened streets, there was still limited electricity in most of the city. He found himself thinking about the future, about rebuilding, not just buildings, but a society, about what kind of Germany might emerge from these ruins. He had no illusions that the road ahead would be easy. Prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight. Hans and those who thought like him would remain a force to be reckoned with. The American occupation itself was fraught with complexities and tensions that would take years to navigate. But for the first time since the war's end, Werner felt something like hope. A tentative, fragile hope, but real nonetheless. If former German officers could stand up for relationships between German women and Black American soldiers, relationships that every aspect of their indoctrination had taught them to despise, perhaps other changes were possible too. Perhaps Germany could indeed build something better from the wreckage of its past. 3 days later, Werner received an unexpected visitor at Magda's house. It was Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, the American officer in charge of the district where Werner lived. Richardson was in his 40s, with graying hair at his temples and the weary but determined expression of a man managing a difficult situation as best he could. "Herr Hoffmann," Richardson greeted him in heavily accented German. "May I come in?" Werner invited him into Magda's small sitting room, offering the better of the 2 remaining chairs. "How can I help you, Colonel?" Richardson studied him thoughtfully. "I've heard about what you and some other former officers did last week, preventing a rather ugly incident involving German women and some of our colored troops." Werner tensed slightly. Was this an official reprimand? The American authorities discouraged fraternization between their soldiers and German civilians, though the rule was inconsistently enforced. "It seemed the right thing to do," Werner said carefully. Richardson nodded. "It was, and not an easy thing, I imagine, given prevailing attitudes." Werner waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "We're establishing a new police force," Richardson continued. "Under American supervision, of course, but staffed by Germans. We need men with leadership experience, but also, how shall I put this, men who have demonstrated a commitment to protecting all citizens, regardless of circumstances." Werner blinked in surprise. "You're offering me a position?" "I'm suggesting you apply," Richardson corrected, "along with some of the other men who stood with you that night. We need police leaders who will enforce the law equally, not selectively. Men the entire community can trust." Werner hadn't considered such a possibility. His plans had focused on returning to teaching once schools reopened. But police work, helping to maintain order in these chaotic times, protecting people, it had a certain appeal. "I'll think about it," he promised. Richardson stood to leave. "Do that. The reconstruction of Germany will require more than bricks and mortar, Herr Hoffmann. It will require men who understand that the old ways led to destruction and who have the courage to help build something better." He extended his hand. "Men like you." After Richardson left, Werner sat for a long time in the gathering dusk, thinking about the colonel's words, about courage and reconstruction, about the possibility of building something new. The Germany he had known, the Germany he had fought for, was gone, shattered beyond repair. But from its ruins, something else could emerge, something that recognized the humanity in all people, that judged character rather than ancestry, that valued connection over division. It would take time, perhaps generations, and it would require people willing to stand up, to challenge old prejudices, to demonstrate through their actions that another way was possible. When Werner finally rose from his chair, he had made his decision. He would apply for the police position, and he would encourage Friedrich and the others to do the same. Together, they would continue what they had started that night on Müllerstrasse, standing against hatred, standing for a different kind of future. 2 weeks later, Werner found himself walking through the Central Park with Sergeant Wilson. Their unlikely friendship had deepened, born from mutual respect and a shared vision of a world beyond the hatreds that had consumed so much of both their lives. "We ship out next week," Wilson said. "My whole unit, transferred to Bremen." Werner nodded, feeling an unexpected sadness. Greta mentioned it. "She's coming with me," Wilson said, a note of wonder in his voice. "We're getting married first. Small ceremony at the American base." "Congratulations," Werner said sincerely. "I'm happy for you both." Wilson smiled. "Thanks. Never thought I'd find something like this in Germany, of all places." He glanced at Werner. "You'll come to the wedding? It would mean a lot to Greta and to me." "I'd be honored," Werner replied. They walked in companionable silence for a while. Through the park where children now played among replanted flower beds, where young couples strolled, where elderly men and women sat on salvaged benches in the spring sunshine. "You know," Wilson said eventually, "what you and your friends did that night, standing against your own people to protect women like Greta. Most folks back home wouldn't believe it. Former German officers defending colored soldiers and their German girlfriends." He shook his head. "Nobody would believe it." "Perhaps they should," Werner said quietly. "Perhaps the world needs to know that even in the darkest places, humanity can reassert itself, that people can change, can grow, can see beyond the lies they've been taught." "Maybe that's the real story of this war," Wilson suggested. "Not just who won or lost, but what we all learned about ourselves, about what we're capable of, both the terrible and the good." As they reached the edge of the park, they could see the city spread out before them, a mixture of ruins and reconstruction. Cranes rose against the sky. Scaffolding covered damaged buildings. People moved purposefully through the streets, carrying materials, clearing debris, rebuilding. "You know what I think, Hoffman?" Wilson said, his voice thoughtful. "I think the real heroes aren't always the ones who fight the wars. Sometimes they're the ones who figure out how to live after them, how to build something better from the wreckage." Werner thought about Friedrich and Elsa, about Robert and Greta, about all the unlikely connections forming in the aftermath of conflict, about his own journey from unquestioning officer to advocate for tolerance, about the painful, halting progress toward a new understanding. "I think you might be right," he said. In the months and years that followed, Werner would often recall that conversation as he built his career in the new police force, emphasizing justice and equal treatment for all. As he attended the weddings of German women and American soldiers, standing as witness to unions that crossed boundaries once thought impermeable. As he watched children born of these relationships grow and thrive in a changing Germany. The story of what those German officers did when they saw German women dating black American soldiers would indeed be one that many would later refuse to believe. It contradicted the simple narratives of good and evil, of heroes and villains that people preferred when thinking about the war. It suggested something more complex and ultimately more hopeful about human nature, that even those indoctrinated in hatred could choose a different path, that compassion could emerge from the most unlikely sources, that in the end, our common humanity might prove stronger than the artificial divisions created to separate us, and that perhaps was the most important lesson to carry forward from the ashes of war, that no matter how deep the darkness, the capacity for change, for growth, for connection remains. In that possibility lies the seed of a better future, one that honors rather than denies our shared humanity. A future worth building one day, one choice, one act of courage at a time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.